I'll start the recording now. So yeah, hopefully that isn't too much of a missed amount of material here. So yeah, so far we've covered and these two different ideas about whether there should be one limiting resource or multiple limiting resources, Liebig's law versus optimal foraging for essential resources. And yeah, sorry that I didn't start the recording early enough to explain this. Again, I won't go through it again, but yeah, definitely if you're catching this recording and you didn't see this first part of the recording, shoot me an email and I can, or maybe I'll just like send everyone an email kind of re-explaining this in text. But yeah, I'll just do that. Sorry about that. And yeah, thanks for letting me know that it wasn't being recorded. But yeah, the outcome of this experiment here is that we kind of have evidence of both Liebig's law of the minimum and a single limiting resource, and the idea that resources can be co-limiting with this last sort of response here. Okay, so let's stop the PowerPoint here for a second and take one of these Menti quizzes. So this Menti quiz will cover a lot about species interactions, including competition, as well as some of the predator-prey and that kind of thing that we've talked about before. All right, so let me share the, actually, let me open it up first and get it started. And now I can share it with y'all. Okay, Menti quiz, the code is 316651. All right, there's quite a few people that haven't joined yet, but maybe they're like using phones or something, so it's hard to have two tabs open. So let's just go ahead and start the Menti quiz. All right, first question here. A human taking antibiotics is an example of what kind of defense against infection? Yep, it's going to be biochemical. Very good. I like your background, Sarah. It's funny. Okay, next question. Why is this not going? Okay, there we go. So long, Finvez. All right, next question. Increasing the mortality rate of a disease is expected to blank the chances of an outbreak. Yeah, it's going to be decreased. This is one of the counterintuitive outcomes of that disease outbreak model that we mentioned. But yeah, decreasing mortality means less of a chance, increasing mortality means less of a chance of spreading the disease from infected individuals to susceptible individuals in that model. All right, next question. In competition for silica, Asterianella has an R star of 0.5, while Cyclotella has an R star of 0.2. Who will win? Yep, it's going to be the lower R star. If you remember, you can kind of think of R star as like the ability of the organisms to survive on the lowest levels of the nutrients, and whichever has a lower R star is going to win in pairwise competition. So yeah, Cyclotella, lower R star, it's going to win. All right. Plants competing for nutrients in the soil are most likely showing what kind of competition? All right, interesting. Yeah, I would say it's most likely exploitative. They're likely affecting each other by just using up the resource. It would only be interference if the plants are basically attacking any competitors, and so like secreting some sort of toxic compounds from their roots that prevent other things from getting the soil nutrients. That would be an example of interference. Um, but yeah, just based on that question, I would have said exploitative. I'll try to make the questions of that about interference versus exploitative more clear um, in the future. But yeah, I would say exploitative for that. All right, I think that was the last question. Yeah. So who won? Nice. Hannah takes it at the last minute. Okay. So that is it for the Menti quiz. Let's switch back to the lecture. All right. So yeah, that's it for competition in terms of like what a limiting resource is. Let's talk a little bit about competition in terms of how it affects population sizes of the things that are competing with each other. So we did the same thing for predator-prey and for host-parasite or host-pathogen interactions with those models. It was like, how does the abundance of hosts affect parasites and vice versa? How does predator abundance affect prey abundance and vice versa? So we'll do the same thing with competition. How does the effect of, or how does the population size of one competitor affect the population size of another competitor? One thing that you might see here, or you might predict, is that the outcome of competition can be a little bit different than the predator-prey kind of interactions or exploitative interactions. And the reason for that is in the predator-prey system and the host pathogen system, the organisms were kind of codependent on each other. So the predators, the ones that are doing the eating, for example, or attacking, in the case of pathogens, are still dependent on the hosts or the prey. And so you tend not to see extinction in those kinds of systems because the predator or the pathogen tends to be pretty self-limiting. By consuming its resource, it's also hurting itself eventually. And so how might that be different with a competitive type of interaction? You predict that these are more unstable. There might be winners and losers of competition, just like competition in other contexts. So you've probably heard about competition from an economics point of view, like big box stores like Walmart and Costco and things out competing small mom and pop type stores, or online sellers out competing physical stores, for example. And in that case, there really are winners and losers, and there has to be some sort of governmental regulation that prevents monopolies from happening and maintains diversity businesses. However, in nature, we see lots of competition still. So I guess the question is competition stable? It looks like it is sometimes, right? We see competition, we see things competing with each other. It's not total situations where you only get one winner. Otherwise, we would see one species in many places, and we don't really see that. And so this so the reason why we often see competition being somewhat stable, and we actually see a bunch of different species coexisting with each other, is likely a result of the relative strength of intra-specific competition and inter-specific competition. So often, as I mentioned, things affect their own growth more than they affect other species growth. And this intra-specific competition is particularly strong and also unavoidable. And so, yeah, maybe things are limiting themselves more than they're limiting other species. But yeah, let's take a look at a model and see if we can kind of figure out when you might get winners and losers versus when you might see species that are competing with each other be stably coexisting over time. I should mention that there probably are situations where competitive exclusion does happen, but they're really hard to see, basically because if it's an unstable interaction, if there is going to be a winner and a loser in terms of competition, what we'll end up seeing is those species occurring in different places. And so the loser would not be able to survive with the winner if they're going to competitively exclude each other. Then we just won't see them competing with each other ever in nature. And so, yeah, there could be situations where there is competitive exclusion. It's just really hard to actually see that playing out in nature, because once exclusion happens, we don't see them competing anymore. All right, and a little bit about competition in terms of who we might predict to be winners and losers. That we've kind of showed already with the R star and with like how well organisms are able to obtain the resource and live on low amounts of resources and that kind of thing. Another way of sort of characterizing competition between two species is whether it tends to be affecting both members of the interaction equally or one member more than the other. And so, yeah, when you have symmetric competition, that's when both individuals or species are equally hurt by competition. Whereas asymmetric is when one individual or species is hurt more than the other by the competition. And so, just like with competitive exclusion, usually it's probably the one that's ended up going extinct and gets excluded. That had a stronger the competitive interaction affected them more strongly than the one that won. So yeah, in the case of asymmetric competition, sometimes you get competitive exclusion. We would expect symmetric competition to result in more stability over time. And we'll kind of see that when we do these models. You could also think about these, like the symmetry of competition as a population level kind of phenomenon, where it's like the individuals or species are hurt in proportion to their size. But yeah, that's symmetric competition versus asymmetric competition. All right, and yeah, we sort of talked about competitive exclusion a little bit already with the silica competing diatoms, the Asterianella and Cyclotella. Here's another example with the ciliates paramecium. And so here I'm showing these experiments by Gauss in the 1930s, really early work looking at competition of these two different ciliate protists in test tubes. Here I'm showing their growth rates when they're grown by themselves. And so yeah, this guy established some small populations of these paramecium, gave them a limited amount of resources, and this is showing their growth over time. You can see the typical logistic type growth with these paramecium, and both of them have a pretty similar carrying capacity around just under 200 individuals with that amount of resources that he gave them. And when he grew these two species together, it turns out that Paramecium caudatum is more strongly affected by their interaction than Paramecium aurelia. And so aurelia survives and persists while caudatum ends up going extinct in this example. So this is an example of competitive exclusion. You can see that he didn't quite run it long enough to see complete extinction of the caudatum. One thing that you can see here is that both species are negatively affected by growing together. Even aurelia, even though it won eventually, you can see that it stabilized at a smaller carrying capacity than it did when it was growing by itself. And so yeah, both of them are negatively affected. But caudatum is affected more, and it looks like it's going to go extinct. And that's an example of competitive exclusion, extinction caused by a competitive interaction. All right, and so yeah, if we expect or if we predict that species are usually there's going to be winners and losers in terms of pairwise competition, you might expect there to be many situations where we see one winner that's just able to survive better in the environment than any of its competitors. And so for each trophic level, for example, each thing that uses resources similarly, you might expect only one kind of species to be represented in communities. But clearly we don't see that. We see lots of diversity in the world, including species that have similar resources. So here I'm showing trees in the Brazilian rainforest, fishes on the coral reef, plants in an open grassland prairie system, and then bacteria in the gut of humans and mice. So yeah, all of these species likely have similar sorts of resource requirements and are living in the same place at the same time and that kind of thing. And so why do we see so much diversity? Why isn't there a competitive exclusion taking place, causing one species to be kind of dominant in these different landscapes? And so yeah, a lot of it might have to do with the specific ways that in which they're getting resources and the ways and the exact resources that they're using. So perhaps they have slightly different resource use, and so they're able to coexist together because of that. And there's actually evidence for this kind of idea from Gauss's experiments back in the 30s, as I mentioned. So we had the example of a competition between Paramecium caudatum and aurelia, where aurelia ends up excluding caudatum. And in that case, both of the Paramecium species in that experiment feed on bacteria that are kind of suspended in the water column of the test tube. And so they're using really similar resources. And so in that case, we saw extinction happening, one winner. However, Gauss also did experiments comparing competition between Paramecium caudatum and Paramecium bursaria. And these species were actually able to coexist long-term with each other. So both of them kind of grew to different carrying capacities here, and then it was stable. They just stayed there. Even though they're both Paramecium, neither species went extinct. And his reasoning, his explanation for that, why did we get extinction in one case and not in the other, is that Paramecium bursaria might be using a slightly different resource. And so he was arguing that they're preferring to eat yeast cells near the bottom of the test tube rather than bacteria that are suspended in the water of the test tube. And so yeah, perhaps that's why we see coexistence in some cases and exclusion in others, is that competitors have evolved to use slightly different resources, and that promotes coexistence. And this led Gauss to come up with this hypothesis called the competitive exclusion principle. And this hypothesis is that two species using the same limited resource in the same way cannot coexist indefinitely. And so his hypothesis was that we expect to see competitive exclusion if the two competitors are using the same resources in the same way. And you expect to see more stable interactions in situations where the competitors have slightly different resource requirements. All right, and this kind of relates to the idea of a question that we had on exam one. Here is that question, I'll just read it. Joseph Connell famously hypothesized that many species used to have much more similar resource requirements than they do now, a hypothesis called the ghost of competition past. Explain how this might happen in terms of an ecoevolutionary feedback. Also describe how this process might affect the diversity of species found in an area. So yeah, there's basically kind of an ecological explanation for this hypothesis and an evolutionary one. The kind of ecological thing is that species that have lots of resource overlap, perhaps they were competing at one point, but competitive exclusion happened and they no longer co-occur together. And so yeah, we don't see competition being as strong as it used to be because of that. Strongly competing species competitively exclude each other and they don't occur in the same places and compete anymore. The kind of evolutionary hypothesis for why we see competition that's less strong than it used to be is that evolution would, natural selection would favor any sort of mutation that results in less resource overlap. In terms of any situation where two species are competing with each other, anytime they evolve to be more specialized, to have slightly different resource requirements, then that's expected to be a favorable mutation and be increase in frequency as a result of natural selection. Because if they're less overlapping in their resource requirements, that means they're competing less. That means their population growth is affected less. They're more successful, and so they pass on more offspring. And so yeah, they've adapted to the biotic kind of landscape by specializing on slightly different resources. If they used to be competing more strongly, they evolved to compete less strongly. And there is a name for this idea that competing species have evolved to have less similar resource requirements and less resource overlap over evolutionary time. And it's called niche partitioning or resource partitioning. And so yeah, this is the idea that evolution has favored adaptation involving specialization on specific kinds of resources for different competing species. And there is evidence that this happens in a lot of cases when you have like a suite of species that are, like similar in terms of their morphology, similar in the kinds of things that they're doing, and often similar in terms of evolutionary history and that kind of thing. They often specialize, so different species are specialists on different aspects, different resources in the environment. So here are some examples of that. So yeah, we've got this suite of warblers here at the top, New World warblers, all evolved probably from a fairly recent common ancestor. All are fairly similar in terms of their shapes and sizes. Their colors are pretty different, but they're basically all doing the same things in terms of how they're getting their food. They're gleaning insects off of tree branches. And so a cursory glance looking at what these birds are doing, you might expect them not to be able to coexist with each other. They're all similar in size and bill morphology and everything. They're all eating insects on trees. So there probably might be one that's going to be competitively dominant and excluding all the others. However, all of these warblers do coexist. You can find them foraging in the same trees and everything. And if you really look at their behavior in a lot of minute detail, as Robert MacArthur did when he came up with these diagrams here that I'm showing you, you could see that they're actually preferring to forage in slightly different parts of trees. So they're all gleaning insects from tree branches, but for example, like the Blackburnian warbler is only going on the outermost branches of the tree. The Cape May warbler is only going to the very tops of the trees. The yellow-rumped warbler is only foraging at the bottoms of the trees. And so yeah, all of them are specialized on eating insects on different parts of the tree, and therefore they're not competing very strongly with each other. And presumably this is a result of evolution favoring specialization for slightly different resources. Same thing here with the Anolis lizards here in Caribbean islands. all of them prefer slightly different habitats and eat insects on different parts of the vegetation there in the plant communities. Same thing with the grassland ungulates here from Africa. We've got all of these different species that are kind of large antelopes that eat grasses, but they have slightly different preferences in terms of the habitat where they're foraging. So some of them are close to the water, some of them are in marshes, some of them are in grassland, some of them are in savannas. And so yeah, they all use the landscape slightly differently, and therefore they don't compete as much with each other as you might expect. Okay, so yeah, that's resource partitioning, evolution of less resource overlap over time, which can promote coexistence and less competition being less strong among the different species that are competing with each other. All right, so those are some ideas about competition and stability. Let's pick up with that model that I mentioned. Yeah, this is going to be a model of competition that predicts the outcome of competition. Like, does competitive exclusion happen? Does one species win, or do they stably coexist, and that kind of thing? And it's based on the population sizes of both competitors. So we're going to be modeling the population sizes of two different competing species and how they affect each other. Assumptions of the model: all individuals within a species are equivalent, so they have the same reproductive rates and that kind of thing. The species have intraspecific competition such that they grow logistically if they're not grown with the other species. And so if it's a species that's growing by itself, it's going to show logistic growth. It's going to reach a carrying capacity as a result of competition among members of the same species. And the final point here is that the effect of competition by one species on the other can be expressed as like adding an amount of the other individuals. And so it's like, basically there's kind of a numerical effect of competition such that increasing the numbers of your competitors will increase the strength of competition in that model. And it kind of makes sense, right? If there are more individuals competing, then competition is expected to be stronger, less resources to go around. All right, and this is going to be called the Lotka-Volterra competition model. You can see that's the same name as the predator-prey model that we went over a couple of classes ago. So yeah, it's the same people who came up with that model, came up with this competition model as well. And it's going to be a modification of the logistic growth equation here that we went over when we talked about population dynamics. And if you recall from that, we've got basically like an exponential growth kind of model. However, there's this term 1 minus n over k, which is kind of an adjustment of that exponential growth rate, or the growth rate in general, I should say, that takes into account that the species have a carrying capacity, like a limit to their population growth. And so yeah, that term modifies the growth rate of the population based on how close the population is to its carrying capacity and whether it's above or below the carrying capacity. All right, so the model is based on logistic growth for both competitors. Let's take a look at it. All right, so the equations are there on the right. You can see there's a different equation for both species. So species 1's population is denoted N1, and species 2's population is denoted N2. And basically, it's exactly the same as the logistic growth equation, except for these terms right here, alpha N2 and beta N1. And what these are is basically the effect of competition on the growth rate of the species. And so here, in species 1's model up here, it's the logistic growth equation for species 1, except we're adding to that term that's like modifying the growth rate, we're adding to that term alpha times N2. And so alpha is the effect of species 2 on species 1. It's like how strong is competition. And then N2 is the population size of its competitor, the population size of species 2. And so yeah, the growth rate is going to be modified by the competition with the other species with this term right here. And so yeah, if this competition coefficient is high and this population size of competitors is really high, then the growth rate is going to be less for species 1. And then the same thing for species 2, we're adding this term beta N1, which is kind of the same thing. Beta is the effect of species 1 on species 2, and N1 is the population size of species 1. So yeah, it's like logistic growth, except it's also including a modification of the growth rate based on the abundance of the competitor and how strong competition is with that competitor. All right, and so what we're going to do with these models is ask the question, under which conditions, if any, would these species coexist? I mentioned that it's kind of a conundrum why we see so many species coexisting with each other when a lot of these pairwise experiments with competition predict competitive exclusion happening, limiting diversity. Okay, so so these models are saying, how does N1 affect N2 and vice versa? We know that based on that model, that as N1 increases, N2's growth rate is going to decrease. And as N2 increases, N1's growth rate is going to decrease as well. And that's a result of competition. Given that they grow logistically and increase when competition is not present, like inter-specific competition, the other species isn't present, then we know that the growth rate can basically switch from being positive to being negative. If the population of the competitor is too high, then it'll cause the population of that species to decrease. So for example, if the population of N2 is really high, such that N1's growth rate is negative, then N1's going to start declining. And just like we did before with graphical analysis, we can predict when that switch point between populations growing and populations shrinking, we can predict when that switch takes place by substituting in 0 for dn dt. So for dn1 dt and dn2 dt, we can figure out when the switch point takes place. And we're solving for isoclines, just like we did with the predator-prey model. All right, so yeah, the question is, when does each species change from growing to shrinking? And we do that by substituting in 0 for the dn dt's. You can try doing that on your own, so you would just be substituting in 0 here for this differential equation part on the left, and then solving for N1 or for N2. But yeah, what you end up getting is here. So yeah, species 1's isocline is N1 equals negative alpha times N2 plus K1. And species 2's isocline is N2 equals negative beta times N1 plus K2. And yeah, these are called the isoclines because they're the range of conditions under which these species are not growing. They have a growth rate of 0. They're neither growing nor shrinking. And so yeah, that's why it's called a 0 growth isocline. And what you can see here is that these are basically equations that take the form of a line. So like the line formula here, y equals mx plus b, you can directly see that kind of structure here with these isoclines. Y equals some slope times x plus some y-intercept here. All right, and so that's going to allow us to kind of see how these species affect each other with graphical analysis by graphing these isoclines together on the same graph and figuring out what happens in each part of the graph there of both of them shown together. Okay, so the next step in graphical analysis would be to graph these two isoclines together on the same coordinate plane and then figure out what's happening in terms of population sizes of both species in each part of the graph. All right, and in order to do that, we have to make sure that we have both isoclines with the same values for x and y. And so we need to have basically solve both of them for either N1 or N2. Right here, I'm showing solving species 1's isocline for N2 instead. So basically just algebraically rearranging this line, solving for x instead of y. So now we've got the y's and x's have switched. So now species 1's isocline is N2 equals -1 over alpha N1 plus K1 over alpha. And yeah, that allows us to graph both of these isoclines together using the same coordinate plane, so the same x and y axis. All right, so finally we can graph the isoclines and determine how the population size for each species changes in all regions of the graph. As I mentioned, both of these are lines. Both of them have a negative slope, so they're both going to be lines with a negative slope on a coordinate plane. And we're going to end up seeing slight differences based on these x and y intercepts. So here's just kind of a generalized look at what species 1's isocline should look like, solved so that N2 is on the y-axis. So yeah, here's the modified isocline for species 1, solved for species 2 values so that it's the y-axis. And yeah, we can solve for, or you can see that the y-intercept here is going to be K1 over alpha. So yeah, that's shown here. This y-intercept is K1 over alpha. We've got a line with a negative slope. And if we solved for the x-intercept, so substituting in 0 for the y-axis here, 0 for N2, we get the x-intercept, and that's going to be the carrying capacity of species 1, K1. So that basically means if there's no competitors, the population of N2 is 0, then species 1 is going to increase to its carrying capacity here. So that's where it has a growth rate of 0. So again, this is the isocline showing the range of values of population sizes where species 1 is not growing or shrinking. It has a growth rate of 0. And just like we did with predator and prey, we can see what's happening in different regions of the graph. So again, this is species 1's isocline. So we're looking at the species that's on the x-axis. And so we're looking for the kind of horizontal component of these vectors that are showing how species 1 is going to respond to different densities. And so yeah, in this blue region of the graph, that's a region of the graph where either the species 1 abundance or the species 2 abundance is so high that the growth rate of species 1 is negative, and so it's going to decline. And that's shown with these arrows pointing to the left. That's species 1 declining in this blue section of the graph. In this kind of pink section of the graph, that means the abundance of species 1 and species 2 is low enough that species 1 has a positive growth rate. And so it's going to increase, and that's shown with these arrows to the right. And so again, we predict that species 1 is going to shrink if it's in the blue area. It's going to grow if it's in the pink area. All right. We can do the same thing with species 2. So here's species 2's isocline. We don't have to modify it because N2 is already the y in that equation for the line here. We can see that the y-intercept is K2, and so that's shown here. The x-intercept, if we substitute in 0 for N2, and then solve for N1, we end up getting K2 over beta, so that's the x-intercept here. And you can see that we have a negative slope. And just like for species 1, you can see what's going to happen to species 2 in the different regions of the graph. And so in the blue section of the graph here, either the population size of N2 or N1 is high enough that it's causing the growth rate of species 2 to be negative, and so it's going to decline, and that's indicated by these downward pointing arrows. In the pink section, population size of N1 and N2 are low enough that species 2 can increase, and so it's growing here, and that's shown with those upward pointing arrows. All right, and as you can predict based on what we did with the predator-prey model, the next step is going to be graphing both of these isoclines together and determining what happens to both species at the same time. And it turns out that this is a little bit different than what we did with the predator-prey model. With the predator-prey model, we had horizontal and vertical lines for those for those isochlines. And so basically they had to intersect with each other. There was no way that a horizontal line can't intersect with a vertical line. However, in this case, both isoclines are just lines with negative slopes. And so there might be some situations where they don't intersect with each other and others where they do intersect with each other. And basically, we predict different kinds of outcomes of competition in those situations, in those different situations where these isoclines intersect and where they don't intersect. And it turns out that the outcome of competition, in terms of whether we see like competitive exclusion versus like stable coexistence and that kind of thing, the outcome actually depends on the relative values of these x and y intercepts and whether the lines intersect or not. And so let's take a look at that here. So we'll kind of go over, there are kind of 4 different possibilities here. There are 4 different x and y intercepts. And so there are 4 different kinds of combinations in terms of which is higher than the other, which result in kind of different dynamics here. So let's look at each of those 4 different possibilities. All right, so one possibility is shown here. We've got species 1's isocline entirely on top of species 2's isocline. And the reason for that is that K1 over alpha is greater than K2, and K1 is greater than K2 over beta. And so, yeah, if we have those kinds of relationships between these x and y intercepts, then species 1's isocline is entirely above species 2's isocline. All right, so let's see what's going to happen with competition in this scenario. All right, so if we're looking just at species 1, that's the species on the x-axis. So we're going to be looking at horizontal lines here showing what species 1's doing. You can see if we're above species 1's isocline, then species 1's going to decline. So that's shown with this arrow facing left. If we're below that black isocline, species 1 is going to increase. And so in both of these kind of pink sections of the graph, species 1 is going to be increasing. And that's shown with those right facing arrows. We can do the same thing with species 2. If species 2 is below its isocline, it's going to increase. So that's this vertical arrow here in this bottom triangle of the graph. If species 2 if we're above the isocline for species 2, then species 2 is going to decline. So that's shown with these downward facing arrows right here. And so I've put these vectors kind of together, and now we can add them together and see what's happening to both species 1 and species 2 at the same time in each section of the graph. And yeah, if we do that, we get this kind of dynamics here. And what you can see here is that no matter where we start on this graph, if we're in the blue section, this middle section, or this pink section, no matter where we start in terms of the starting abundance of species 2 and species 1, we predict basically that species 1 is going to win in competition here. So say we start in this graph where the population sizes are low and both species can increase. Both species increase kind of going this direction here until we hit the isocline for species 2. So in this case, species 2 can no longer grow. It starts declining as we enter this region of the graph. Species 1 is still increasing here. Species 1 is also decreasing. But yeah, we grow here until we hit species 2's isocline. Now we're in this section of the graph where both species are declining. Sorry, I got that wrong. Species 1 is increasing. So yeah, as we go here until we hit species 2's isocline. At that point, species 1 is still growing, and so we cross over that isocline into this section of the graph, and so we go down this direction where species 1 is increasing, species 2 is decreasing, until we hit this x-axis here. So now there's none of species 2, and so we continue growing with species 1 until it reaches its carrying capacity. And so, yeah, the outcome of competition in this case, when species 1's isocline is completely above species 2, is that species 1 is expected to win and increase to its carrying capacity. Species 2 is expected to go extinct. All right, and that is shown here with these values for the x and y intercepts here. If K1 over alpha is greater than K2, and K1 is greater than K2 over beta. All right. The next possibility is that species two's isocline is completely above the isocline for species one. And we could solve for the vectors and get this kind of outcome here. So here, no matter where we start in the graph, we expect species two to win. And so yeah, the vectors are pointing us here to the final outcome of species two increasing to its carrying capacity and species one going extinct. And that happens if the x and y intercepts have this kind of relationship to each other, k1 over alpha less than k2, and k1 less than k2 over beta. Okay, finally, we have the more complicated scenarios where the isoclines actually cross each other. So first, we've got this kind of scenario where k1 over alpha is less than k2, and k1 is greater than k2 over beta. So if that's the case with these x and y intercepts, then we get this kind of intersection here. And if you solve for the vectors here, you end up getting a kind of weird scenario here where the outcome of competition depends on the initial conditions. And so, yeah, this shows that in this section of the graph and in this section of the graph, like both species are increasing here, both species are decreasing here. And so it's kind of pushing us toward this intersection here of the isoclines. However, in these other parts of the graph, the purple and the yellow parts of the graph here, one species is increasing and one species is decreasing. And they're doing so such that one species is favored and the other species is going extinct. So yeah, in this case, either species one or species two might win, and it depends on where we start in terms of like the abundance of N2 and N1 that we start with. So for example, if you follow my cursor, say we're over here up in the upper part of this blue section of the graph, we'll kind of decline here until we hit species two's isocline. We enter this purple area of the graph, and that's where species one is declining and species two is increasing. So we'll go to species two being the winner here if we start up here in this part of the blue. However, if we go here to the lower part of the blue section, you can see that the vector is pointing us in this direction. We'll hit species one isoclines first, and that's going to cause species one to start decreasing, sorry, species one to start increasing, and species two still decreasing here. So we go down to the x-axis. Species one increases to its carrying capacity, and it wins in this part of the graph. So yeah, in this kind of scenario with these x and y intercepts that I'm showing here, this kind of relative values for the x and y intercepts, there are alternative stable states. So either species one wins or species two wins, depending on the initial conditions. You might be asking, does this happen in nature? Do we see this kind of alternative stable states happening in nature? And it turns out you do. There's something called priority effects, where two strongly species competing with each other, like the outcome of competition depends on who starts with a higher population size. And so if, say you have a newly created patch of habitat and one competitor colonizes it first and starts growing its population in that patch first, it can kind of establish itself such that it's in a region of this graph where it has a higher population size than its competitor, which is going to promote it winning. Anytime you get one species having a higher starting abundance than the other in this kind of scenario, that species has the advantage. So for example, if we're here where both species are increasing in a newly created habitat, if there's more N2s than there are in N1s, then we're starting here in this section of the graph. We hit the purple part first, and N2 ends up, species two ends up winning. If we're in a scenario where there's more N1s to start with, we hit species two's isocline first, and so species one wins. So yeah, the initial abundance actually can determine the outcome of competition. And we do actually see that. There are experiments in nature that show these priority effects, where if one species is able to get to a habitat patch first, it can competitively exclude the other from getting in. And so the outcome depends on which one gets there first. All right, someone has asked something in the chat. So let me pull that up. Someone's asking me to show the cat. Yes, I do have a cat. She's upset because she's trapped in here. But yeah, this is baby cat. Say, hey, baby cat. I'll let her out because she's upset. Yeah, she's really cute. All right. Let's see, how much time do we have left? We have 5 minutes left. That's enough time to finish this. Okay, so the final sort of outcome from these Lotka-Volterra models is this scenario here. So here we have the isoclines intersecting again. We've got the intercepts, like the relative values of the intercept, such that K1 over alpha is greater than K2, and K1 is less than K2 over beta. And so here we have the species isoclines crossing again, but crossing in the kind of other orientation. And in this case, if you do the vectors again, see which species, like which areas of the graph the different species are increasing and decreasing, you get the vectors that I'm showing here, where in all the sections of the graph, the vectors kind of pointing to the intersection of the two isoclines. And so, yeah, in this scenario, we predict stable coexistence between both species. So this is the only kind of scenario in these Lotka-Volterra models where both species coexist indefinitely. And so, yeah, you get both species, both competitors, able to survive in the face of competition with each other. And if you can see here, the intersection of these lines are going to be slightly lower than the carrying capacity of both species. So the competition is still hurting species 1 and species 2. The intersection of the line is of these isoclines is going to make the stable population size of both species slightly below its carrying capacity of what it would be if it was growing by itself. So yeah, if we go over to the y-axis here, you can see that intersection has a slightly lower value for N2 than K2. Same thing for the x-intercept. If we go down to the x-axis from that intersection point, the stable equilibrium value for N1 is slightly below its carrying capacity. But the outcome of the model in this scenario is that both species persist with each other indefinitely. They don't drive each other to extinction. So yeah, kind of a cool outcome. You can get a model that predicts stable coexistence between two competitors, but it requires the scenario that I'm showing here in the bottom with the x-intercepts and the y-intercepts. So the values for the carrying capacities and the competition coefficients have to be what I'm showing you down there in order to get stable coexistence. Okay, so just to kind of sum up the outcome of graphical analysis of this Lotka-Volterra model, we get 4 different outcomes, 4 different possible outcomes based on the relative size of the x and y intercepts of the isoclines. Either one species wins or the other species wins, or the outcome depends on the initial conditions, or they coexist. All 4 possibilities can happen. It just depends on the isoclines and how they cross and that kind of thing, or whether they cross. All right, so the next thing that I would do is talk about specifically kind of focus on that scenario where the competitors coexist with each other. So this specific scenario where we get K2 over beta greater than K1 and K1 over alpha greater than K2. So next time we meet, I'll pick up with this discussion of the Lotka-Volterra models and kind of focus on this specific scenario that allows species to coexist, because again, the kind of impetus for creating this model was trying to explain why we see so many situations in nature where competing species coexist with each other. So is this scenario that I'm showing right here, is that a common scenario to see? And so we'll kind of go through that in the next class on Tuesday. All right, any questions before we break for the weekend? I'll open up the chat again. All right, looks like there aren't any questions. So yeah, thanks so much for tuning in. Remember that next week we're switching to the new time for the live Zoom meetings. We're switching to 10 a.m. to 11:15 a.m. Again, sorry if you can't make it to that, but the recording will be uploaded onto Canvas. And also I will hold office hours from 3 o'clock until 3:30, sort of during the end of our normal class time, so that if you have any questions, if you have a chance to watch it, either during the normal class time or slightly before or something, you'll have an opportunity to ask me any questions that you have about it. All right, thanks so much. Y'all have a good weekend. I'll see you later.
So Robbie, are you going to, you're going to do an email for the bit of the lecture that didn't get recorded?
Right, yeah, thanks for reminding me for doing that. Yeah, so that was just
it was the first
learning resources.
20 minutes. Yeah.
Right.
So it wasn't too much.
Right. Yeah, I'll just do it with text. It shouldn't be too long. Like I'm pretty long-winded with my explanations. I think I could be a lot more concise in words.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I hear that. All right. See you later.
All right. Yeah. Have a good weekend.